I'm in Houston, Texas.
Oh, well.
If you've ever been here, if you don't like the weather, wait 30 minutes and it will change. I'm in.
Oh, let's see. All the time.
Anything else?
So yes, it's yeah, it's a little warm for me today, but I would like it to be about 10 degrees cooler.
How hot did it get today?
It's like low 90s.
Oh, well, when I was living in Savannah, I always made it a rule that I never complained about the heat until August. And then in August, I just took to my couch and didn't move and complain for an entire month.
But what's very interesting is we moved here from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and South Florida is 10 degrees cooler than Savannah right now.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they're both on the ocean. That's weird.
Right. And normally you would think that further south in, South Florida, it would be hotter, but for some reason, this wave of heat has not gone so far south as to affect South Florida at this point.
Oh my. Well, I guess you can head down to the beach, but not on the weekend.
Right. No, we're just like, you stay in your air conditioning and, survive that way.
Well, yeah, it's good kvetching weather.
Right. I mean, the thing that's interesting though is like it's still at the point where in the evenings after the sun goes down, it does cool off enough that like if you want to go sit on your porch or something, you can still do that.
Right. Yeah, the whole earth has to warm up too, and the bodies of water. There's always a lag.
Right.
And do you live downtown?
Ardsley Park.
Yeah. So there's just lots of pavement.
Right. But the other night, after the sun went down, we went outside and sat on the porch and had a glass of wine, and it was perfectly comfortable.
Nice.
So
yeah, sounds good.
But I know that once we get to July and August, even the nights tend to be pretty hot and humid. The humidity has not gone sky high yet, so that's probably what's helping.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I know those days in July that are, it's 80-90% humidity.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Hello. Chris. It's those days when you can walk out the door and cut the air with a knife.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, that's what it feels like. It feels like a blanket. When you walk out with that humidity is so high, it feels like you're walking into a wet blanket.
It's true.
It's always that way here in Houston. Always. You feel like you're in a sauna.
Yeah, well.
That's I have
there may be something good about that. I don't, for your skin, maybe, I had a good friend that when we lived in Fort Lauderdale, when she would come to visit, she loved the humidity because she said it was good for her skin. I'm like, okay. Hello.
Hi.
Tonight, before I start the session, you all have to sing a rousing chorus of Hooray for Hollywood.
Hooray for Hollywood.
And I want it in 3-part harmony.
Can I just rewatch Gregory Peck and A Gentleman's Agreement?
There you go. Oh yeah, you could do that. No, it's I would never ask anybody to do anything by singing because trust me, I can't sing at all. I try.
Tim, I just wanted to say we're from New Jersey here, and we have some guests here, so I want you to be on your best behavior. I hope you brought your A game tonight, because I told these people how wonderful you are. So don't
geez, the pressure. The pressure.
Okay, a lot of pressure here.
Oh my God.
I hope they behave also.
You're in New Jersey?
We're in New Jersey.
Are you in New Jersey?
New Jersey, yeah.
Hi, who's that?
Noel.
Oh,
Hi, Flossie. Hi, Jeff. How are you?
Lisa.
Hey, Chris. Chris, this is my friend Jack. Hi.
A camera on your TV?
yes.
Some I don't know. Looks like a very fancy hotel lobby or something. Oh, that's Kara. Looks like she's in a fancy hotel lobby.
It's that green screen thing.
Okay, because yeah, you look like you're in some like shishi hotel back there or something. Like right around the corner is the cocktail bar.
It's the one one near the plant downtown.
Okay.
It's cute. It's pretty.
Yeah. We have quite a few very nice hotels here in Savannah. So we just met friends. I mean, we went out for the first time in over a year to an actual like meet friends and sit and talk. It was so weird after having done it for a year. But we went downtown Savannah to the Savoy Society, which is kind of like a wine bar, craft cocktails. And then it also has cheese and tapas and things. What a cute, cool place.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really cute, really interesting food. Not your same old, really interesting things that you can order, like small plates to share, and a nice selection of wines. They make some very interesting cocktails with ingredients I've never heard of. I kept asking the server, like, what is that? I've never heard of this ingredient. But they know their stuff. When you ask them questions, they can answer. So if you're ever looking for a cute place to go and, have a glass of wine and a little nibble with somebody, I would recommend it highly. And they only play vinyl. All the music in there, they put vinyl LPs on. So sometimes they're a little scratchy, like vinyl LPs. And I'm old, so I don't know who will remember this, but while we were in there, they were playing the Shangri-La's greatest hits. I'm like, oh my gosh, the Shangri-La.
Walking in the sand.
I remember, I'm old.
Yeah. Because all of a sudden, Leader of the Pack came on, with the motorcycles and the whole thing. Yeah, so I would recommend it if you're looking for a kind of cool place to meet with friends. And, they were very, very, you could sit there and talk and chat, and they were very accommodating. And, so just my little plug for a local business in Savannah, because it's locally owned by people who live in the community. So.
What is it called, Tim, again?
Savoy Society.
Savoy. And
it's on Liberty. If you know where the DeSoto Hotel is on Liberty, it's in the bottom of that Drayton Tower apartment complex on Liberty. It's down that way. And I think they pretty much have their menu online, so you can kind of look at it. Probably changes occasionally, but get an idea of what they offer. They probably have their wine list on there as well.
Oh, the Savoy, right? The
Savoy Society. Savoy Society.
Thank you.
I mean, I don't normally do commercials, but it was just such a cute little place, They're not giving me a cut for this. They're not giving me a kickback. Like, they didn't say, plug us and then we'll give you a free cocktail the next time you come in. Although if they offer one, I would take it.
Are they opening one in Portugal, maybe?
I don't know. All I know is everybody keeps asking us if we're going to open like a wine and cheese place in Portugal, and our answer is a resounding no.
Yeah, just put a nice slice there.
I just want to go enjoy other people's wine bars and other people's cheese shops and whatever. And we just found out that somebody opened a brand new cheese shop in Porto that is supposed to be very, very cool. So I'm sure that will be one of our destinations.
I've had it.
Portugal?
And Portugal, yeah.
No shortage of wine and cheese in Portugal.
Yeah, I think so. And sardines.
Okay, I'm gonna give it 2 more minutes and then we'll get started because we have the rabbi at 8. So we're not. It's the one thing about this is it forces me to get things going. The rabbi's got a meeting at 8. I don't dare step on the rabbi's toes. Like Rabbi, I'm sorry you have to wait because so I always make sure it's like, okay, we'll be done, Rabbi. Don't worry. Well, anyway, I hope everybody's doing well and enjoying whatever you're enjoying right now, wherever you are, hot, cool.
Enjoying The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon a lot. I'm about halfway through.
Oh yeah, it's a great book. It's heavy duty reading. It's disturbing at times because of the subject matter is disturbing, but I really think it's a really, really interesting book.
Yeah.
Historically of the period. There are times when the description's a little too gory for my taste, but it is what it is. I mean, he's not shying away from, what really was going on then.
Thank you for the good rec.
You are very welcome. Very welcome.
Jim, are you on next week?
No, next week we will not have class because of the board meeting. It's the first Tuesday. June 1st happens to be the first Tuesday. And of course, the synagogue board usurps me. They have more clout than I do. So our next class won't be until June 8th. So
June 8th, okay.
But I'll send out a reminder just so nobody tries to tune in. Of course, maybe you'll end up at the board meeting, not that you would want to be, but I don't know that the board meetings are particularly thrilling. Maybe they are. Maybe they're really exciting. I don't know.
They do it painless.
But anytime I've ever gone to any kind of board meeting for anything I've been involved with, they're generally not very exciting.
Want me to save you some?
So now they've added this. There's a voice now that comes on Zoom that never used to. That's really weird. Anyway, maybe you guys didn't hear it, but I did. Anyway, I'm going to mute everybody so we can get started. Again, feel free to unmute. If you want to make a comment or have a question or have something to add, feel free to do that. I'm perfectly okay with that. So this week we're talking about Jews in Hollywood, and it's an interesting subject because I'm sure we have all heard at some point or read perhaps at some point the idea that, well, the Jews own Hollywood. Or the Jews run Hollywood. I mean, we hear that statement very, very frequently. It's expressed, it's written, some people believe it, some may not, but let's look today and see just how true is that. Do the Jews really own Hollywood? Do the Jews really run Hollywood? So we'll try to get to an answer to that and draw your own conclusions by the time that we finish this. So when we are looking at the very start of what would become filmmaking, movie making, Hollywood, etc., a lot of people don't know that initially filmmaking started on the East Coast. We think of it as very, very much a California thing, although now films are made all over the place. But initially, we think of Hollywood, we think of West Coast, but the very beginnings of filmmaking actually were on the East Coast, really around New York City, surprise, surprise, because performers were in New York City. We had Broadway stage, we had Broadway theater. So there were quite a number of performers already on the East Coast, and particularly in New York. But filmmaking in its infancy on the East Coast was really having a lot of trouble getting off the ground, getting the momentum that it needed. If it was going to be taken seriously as a cultural form, an art form, it faced a lot of problems trying to get off the ground. And why is that? Why was it difficult to get off the ground? Well, quite simply, there was a great deal of anti-Semitism on the East Coast. Surprise, surprise. And so since some of these young whippersnappers who were trying to become filmmaking moguls and filmmaking producers, directors, etc., happened to be from Jewish backgrounds, they encountered a bit of resistance to the whole notion of filmmaking. Most of these young people were not from well-to-do families. They were not from wealthy backgrounds. Most of them were actually from relatively poor backgrounds, many of them growing up in the tenement areas of New York City, some maybe of more perhaps modest means than poor, but these were not people who came from a great deal of wealth. So trying to break down the doors, trying to break down some of the barriers was not particularly easy for them. So encountering the resistance to this fledgling industry of filmmaking, they decided to follow Horace Greeley's command of go west. You remember the go west, young man, the whole idea of go west? Well, they decided, let's just pick up, let's get out of the East Coast, let's get out of the New York environment, and let's go west. And interestingly enough, as they decided to go west, they found that there was support on the West Coast for what they were trying to do. And nobody really cared about their Jewish backgrounds. It really became sort of a non-issue. So they had a greater amount of success. Yes, question, Lori?
Yeah, I'm gonna just chime in with a quick comment. I should mention any comments I come up with are plagiarized from the documentary Hollywoodism, like the word Hollywood with IS in Judaism, which looked at this issue. Just two quick things. One, a great little anecdote. One of the people who eventually became a good producer, one of the great studio heads, his mother, I believe it was, discovered movies and made the comment, I've discovered this great business. People pay cash and they pay for the product before they consume it. It was just one of those great comments.
That's true, because you pay for a movie ticket, you don't know whether you walk in, you're going to like it, hate it, or whatever.
Right. But you pay in advance. Nobody has to try to collect after. The other is, my understanding was that really it was a number of them broke away from Edison, who I guess was, sort of had taken the lead on East Coast movie making in New Jersey. I forget the town, but it was his anti-Semitism primarily.
Yes, I mean, he was a known anti-Semite. Very true, very true. And maybe there was a hand in that. In some of the research, I didn't actually come across his name, but I'm not saying that that's probably not a factor, because we do know that Thomas Edison harbored anti-Semitic views, so that certainly could have played a part in it, no doubt. So anyway, they go west. They're on the West Coast now, and they are starting to set up this fledgling industry of filmmaking. And as this sort of gets off the ground, others follow these people saying, hey, it looks like we can do this. So we have producers, we have some performers. Not every performer was successful on the Broadway stage. And so film was going to offer some performers who perhaps were not as successful on Broadway to have an outlet for their, acting and such in this new market of filmmaking. So before too much longer, we had this sort of beginning that would become a thriving business. And it was, in fact, very, very Jewish. Most, if not the majority, of the early studio heads were, in fact, from Jewish backgrounds. And they were also from backgrounds, many of them had worked on the East Coast to make money just to survive. Many of them had come from the garment industry. So they knew and understood the value of hard work. They understood that anything that was going to be successful was going to take a great deal of effort. They already had some element of street sense or street smarts, if you want to call that, and that was going to help them to get this industry off the ground. So they were coming with a lot of education that wasn't necessarily formal education, because most of these people had little formal education. They had a lot of street education. They had a lot of education through effort and hard work, but formal education, not really so much. So, but that was going to serve them well, because if you're trying to get anything off the ground, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of effort. So they were willing to put that time in, and they were willing to put that effort in to this newfound business of movie making. So when we get to the early 1930s, okay, and now we are beginning to establish movie studios and the whole studio system, which would run Hollywood for a good 20 to 25 years. We were getting into the idea of films that were going to have talk, dialogue. They were no longer going to be silent. At this time, there were 8 major Hollywood studios that were running successfully in Hollywood. Of those 8 major studios, 6 of them were run by people of Jewish background. Now, I'll give you their names. You don't have to remember who they are, but just so you know. So, of course, we have Louis B. Mayer of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM. We have Carl Laemmle Jr., who was the head of Universal Studios. We have Marcus Loew, who was also part of MGM, plus the Loew's theater chain, For those of you who are old like me and can remember the Lowe's Theater chain of way, way back, we had Adolf Zucker, who was at Paramount Studios, Harry Cohn, who would run Columbia Pictures, Jesse Lasky, who was also at Paramount. Then we had the Warner Brothers. We had Harry, Sam, Albert, and Jack Warner, who of course became the Warner Brothers and Warner Brothers Studios, very successful. Just a little plug, my very favorite Hollywood star of the golden era is none other than Bette Davis. And Bette Davis worked for Warner Brothers. Even Bette Davis's worst films were better than some good films. That's just my little plug. I will watch a Bette Davis film. I would watch Bette Davis read The Telephone Book if she were still alive, because she's that talented. And then, of course, we have Samuel Goldwyn, who was also part of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, so at MGM. So here you have these Jewish men who were running what was to become one of the major businesses in the United States of America. And they were going to have a very, very profound responsibility. And they knew they had a profound responsibility, given that the films coming out of Hollywood were not only going to stay in the United States, but ultimately find their way overseas to European markets and countries all over the world. They knew that they had the power in their hands with the films that they made to shape how America, the United States of America, was going to be seen abroad. Because people would look at these films coming out of Hollywood, coming out of these United States of American studios, and that was going to show the world, this is America. So this is a pretty heady responsibility when you think about it, that they had this power to send these films all over the world and give the whole world a sense of what America is all about. Now, I'm not saying that they always did it well. I'm not saying that they always did it truthfully. I'm not saying that they always, had the best interests of the country at heart. But nonetheless, people were going to understand a great deal about America from the films that were going to be all over the world. Now, most of these men who were running these studios had actually grown up in observant Jewish homes. So they did not grow up without any sense of Judaism. They did not grow up without any sense of their Jewish heritage. Some knew Hebrew and some knew it pretty well. And most actually had become bar mitzvah. So they did have Jewish backgrounds. They did have Jewish knowledge. They did have the knowledge of Hebrew. So they did understand where they came from. However, if you look at the movies, think of your favorite, if you're an old movie buff and you think of your favorite movies from the 1930s, which was really a very golden age for the studios and one of the prominent stars that we would come to know and love, you don't see much in the way of Judaism. You don't see much of anything in the way of Jewish content, Jewish storylines, Jewish history. So you would think, well, okay, so here are these men who came from relatively observant homes, who understood some Hebrew, who had been bar mitzvah. So why are they not drawing on some of their own background for some of the films that they were making? But if you were to look at movies of the 30s, you're going to see next to no Jewish content. Their goal in Hollywood was one of those words that some of us hate, assimilation. Assimilation. They wanted assimilation into the mainstream of American life, American culture, and that mainstream American life. If you think about middle America and you think about mainstream American life, mainstream American culture, it was really pretty far removed from anything that was overtly Jewish, in spite of the fact that the Reform movement's headquarters were in middle America, in Cincinnati, Ohio. So there's that. But they really, really were trying to assimilate through the movies that they were showing, through the stories that they were choosing to present in film, this sort of assimilationist idea. They portrayed very, very little that was Jewish. In spite of that, the one thing that they did do because they realized, okay, we're Jewish, we got to do something Jewish. They all contributed greatly with a lot of money, a lot of financial elements to building Wilshire Temple in Los Angeles. So here you have all of these studio heads, and they said, well, we're not really doing much in our movies with Judaism. We're not really showing Jewish characters and Jewish stories, but we can do something by building a synagogue where people can go and pray. And that will be our way of supporting Judaism. So they all contributed great sums of money to building Wilshire Temple in downtown Los Angeles. But all of them were, other than that, pretty well united in sort of, if you want to call it, a rejection of their background, their culture, their religious heritage. And, you know, again, the whole idea was to assimilate into the mainstream of Middle America. Now, this posed a great irony. It was well known that these studio heads were from Jewish backgrounds. It was well known that they had grown up in, you know, observant to somewhat observant Jewish families. And so anti-Semites would frequently point the finger at these studio heads and at Hollywood in general and say, you know, you're trying to undermine American values with your Jewish values. Yet here they were trying desperately to embrace very much American values, middle American values in the film. So it was almost like they couldn't win. So all of these people were pointing the finger and saying, you're trying to, you know, inculcate Judaism and ideas of Judaism into American culture, when they were saying, oh, but no, we are not doing that. We are trying, in fact, to stay away from things that were overtly Jewish. So they kind of got caught in this sort of ironic situation, if you will. They wanted the world. Remember, they were going to shape this vision of America for the entire world. They wanted the world to see America and American people, all of us who live here, to see us as attractive people, to see us as very resilient people, and they wanted to see us as very strong people. So an America that was attractive, an America that was resilient, and an America that was strong. That's what they really wanted to put out there to the world. That's what they wanted the rest of the world to see the United States as being. And if you go back and think of movies of the 30s, you can probably see how much of that was successfully conveyed through the stories and through the kind of films that were being released. Staying away from, again, as I said, anything that was overtly Jewish and storylines that were overtly Jewish. Now we know. So now we've got performers and people flocking to Hollywood. So you come to Hollywood and you're a young Jewish woman or you're a young Jewish guy and you want to become a star in Hollywood. Fantastic, fantastic. But you can't have a Jewish sounding name. So part of early Hollywood is, okay, your name is a little too Jewish. You know, we're not going to put that up on the marquee, you know, for your new film opening. We don't want that scrolling through the credits, you know, when people are seeing who the stars of the film are. So many of the Hollywood stars would be given a name that was much more a Middle American sounding name that was not overtly Jewish. So let me quiz you a little bit here. Let's see who knows their history. Who did Nathan Birnbaum become in Hollywood? His name was Nathan Birnbaum, but that's not the name we know him by. Anybody have a guess? Nathan Birnbaum would come down to us known as George Burns. George Burns. I guess Burns may be slightly a little bit Jewish, but not overtly Jewish. Does anybody know who Bernard Schwartz became? Bernard Schwartz. We never saw the name Bernard.
Tony Curtis.
Tony Curtis. Woo, bing, 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 bing. That is correct. So he goes from being Bernie Schwartz to being, you know, nice little Bernie growing up to being Tony Curtis. Okay. Let's try another one. What about Betty Persky? Betty Persky. Betty Persky would come down to us as the very, very attractive actress Lauren Bacall.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so and actually people called her Betty Bacall. She loved the name Betty, and so she would use it outside of Hollywood. So you would, if you read things about her, a lot of her friends would call her Betty Bacall because her original name was Betty. Okay, just a couple more. Who did Bernice Frankel become? Bernice Frankel. And you all know who she is. You've all watched her. I'm sure you have. So Bernice Frankel, we would know better as B. Arthur of the Golden Girls and Maude and all of that. So yes, so Bernice Frankel took the name B. Arthur. Joan Malinsky. Joan Malinsky. I'll give you a hint. Can we talk? Can we talk?
Joan Rivers.
Joan Rivers.
Joan Rivers. So Joan Malinsky became Joan Rivers. How about Jerome Silberman? Jerome Silberman, we know better as Gene Wilder.
Oh.
Of blessed memory. And the last one, a little more up to date, so these people, even today, people, if they have particularly ethnic sounding names, Natalie Hirschlag. Natalie Hirschlag, we know better today as Natalie Portman.
Oh.
Natalie Portman. So this is what, if you're going to make it in Hollywood in front of the camera as a star, as an ingenue, you wanted to play, important roles in Hollywood films, you were told you need to have a name that is going to be a little bit more, simple for middle Americans to understand, does not have, and let me just back up a second and say other people with ethnic names, even if they weren't Jewish, from Eastern Europe, etc., were also frequently asked to change their names. They wanted pronounceable names. They wanted names that would look good when they were going by on the credits, that weren't too long, weren't too clearly ethnic. So it wasn't always just Jewish actors, actresses, but if you had a particularly strong ethnic sounding name, then frequently you were asked to change it. The other thing that happened is if you came to Hollywood and perhaps you looked a little too ethnically Jewish, sometimes the studio heads would say, you need to have some plastic surgery. You need to have a little cosmetic surgery to just sort of, soften the features a little bit more, acceptable, again, to mainstream middle America. If you really want to be successful, if your goal is to be, an Academy Award winning performer in an Academy Award winning film. Today, of course, we look at modern performers and they revel in some of their ethnicity, and it actually gives them a sense of character and whatever. But that's not what they were going for in the 1930s in Hollywood. They just saw that as something that would keep you from becoming perhaps the performer that you could be. They weren't doubting your talent. They just were doubting the fact that middle America would buy into you. Maybe they would have, but we don't know. We just don't know. So the studios just really wanted to stay away from anything that was too radically ethnic because they felt that it would damage their American credentials, their good American background. An example would be they made a film called They Won't Forget. They Won't Forget came out in the mid-30s. It's not a film I've ever seen. I don't know how successful it was when it was released, but it was a film that was based on a very important historic event, and a very important historic event here in the state of Georgia. And that was, of course, the lynching of Leo Frank. If you remember the story of Leo Frank being lynched when the people thought justice wasn't being served, he was lynched because he was Jewish. And in the film about Leo Frank, the word Jew is never spoken. Never spoken. So how are you doing a film about a lynching of a man because of his Judaism and because he is Jewish without using any word that says Jew or Jewish? You've got to kind of wonder about that. You've got to kind of wonder, but that was the fear. We'll make the story, but how, I kind of would like to see the film. I really would. I have a feeling it was not a blockbuster movie because I'm pretty well versed in Hollywood movies, and I've never ever come across it ever. What's the channel on TV? Turner Classic Films and all that. I've never seen it show up, and they do some obscure things, but I've never ever seen it.
Tim,
So yeah,
I'm sorry. Was it a silent movie or was it a sound movie?
no, this is when we're already into the talkies when we got
this-
dialogue.
okay, thank you.
Yes. All right, so we're in the 30s, we're going into the early 1940s. And of course, we have the outbreak of the war, World War II. Well, the studios, all of the Hollywood studios, all of the Hollywood moguls realized that this was their chance to really jump on the patriotic bandwagon in support of the war effort. They were willing to produce films for next to nothing. Stars were willing to forego their salaries, which at that time were considered very high, but by our standards, not so much, in order to make films that would help to, give the patriotic idea, to bolster the war effort. If you've ever seen the movie, I think it's called Thank Your Lucky Stars, which has a bevy of Hollywood stars, and it made by Warner Brothers. All of their stars were in the movie for doing some kind of song and dance routine, including Bette Davis. She sings and dances in the movie. And we don't think of Bette Davis as the kind of singer-dancer kind of star. And they would do these films for nothing. The Hollywood performers would go and work at the Hollywood Canteen on the West Coast, where the service people who were coming back would go and have a chance to relax and to eat and to socialize and to, get away from the drudgery of having served overseas. And many of the Hollywood people did this on their own time. Now, were they forced into it by the studio heads? Probably to some extent, yes, but they saw this as their bid. It was good for the film industry for them to be seen in these places, doing something for the war effort to bolster, American and to sell US war bonds and things of that sort. So, and they made a lot of short movies that would be shown before the feature film. They would make these shorts, these patriotic short films of about 15 minutes or so that were all about, being good Americans and doing what you can do for the war effort and supporting rationing if rationing was enforced, et cetera, et cetera. So Hollywood really did see World War II as its chance to really further its American credentials. And of course, after the war, so now we're in the mid-1940s, the war ends in 1945. And there would be discovery of the horrors of the Holocaust. And as in so much in Jewish history, as in so much in history in general, the realization of what was going on and what was found by Allied soldiers when they marched into some of the death camps and concentration camps that were dotting Eastern, Southern, even Western Europe, would really force everybody to kind of take a step back and do a little bit of reassessing of who are we and where are we and what should we be doing. As I think most of you know, it was a film director not from Hollywood, not from California, but from Great Britain, who would be called over to Europe to film the liberation of the Nazi death camps. And that was the filmmaker that we all know for classic films like Psycho, Rear Window, Vertigo, Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock was brought to Europe to film literally what Allied soldiers were discovering when they went into some of the camps, because General Eisenhower and the other Allied generals said, if we don't have a record of this, people are not going to believe it. And so we do have a filmed record of it, and people still don't believe it. We still have people denying it, even though we have filmed records of it. But these generals were smart enough to know that they needed to have some sort of recorded history. So the film industry would take a step into this horror and document what had been going on. One of the first steps out of the "we're fearful of doing anything Jewish" came in 1947. Would be the first time that Hollywood would be brave enough, one of the Hollywood studios anyway, would be brave enough to tackle the subject of anti-Semitism straight on, head on, without shying away from it as a subject matter for a major Hollywood film. And that was the film Gentleman's Agreement. Gentleman's Agreement, which is still today regarded as, a real classic of Hollywood, still a very highly regarded film, was 1947. So we're talking 2 years after the close of the war, 2 years after the discovery of the horrors of the Holocaust. And it was 20th Century Fox Studios who stepped up and took that sort of brave stand to say, we are going to make this movie. Now, the script was based on a best-selling novel. Laura Hobson had written the novel Gentleman's Agreement. It had been a best-selling book, a best-selling novel, and it had been shopped around to all the Hollywood studios. They had a script, and they were taking it to all of the different studios. Would you be interested in making this into a film? Would you be interested in, casting some of your, stable of stars into this film? And in most cases, they had a very resounding no. No, no, no. We are not interested in touching this film. We are not interested in touching this subject matter. Many of them felt that if they said yes, that it would stir up trouble and it would actually cause a rise in anti-Semitic actions, that there would be anti-Semitic backlash if this film were made. It was 20th Century Fox, as I said, and interestingly enough, the leader or the head of 20th Century Fox was Darryl Zanuck. Darryl Zanuck, who wasn't Jewish.
Right.
He was not Jewish.
Right.
So the studio that would make this film, this really, open film on anti-Semitism, was made by a studio whose head was not one of the Jewish studio heads. And maybe that's why he felt like, he could maybe take the chance more so than a studio head who was Jewish. Interestingly enough, a little anecdotal story that I found was during the making of Gentleman's Agreement, of course, it was in all the trade papers that 20th Century Fox was making Laura Hobson's book into a major Hollywood film with major Hollywood stars. It was interesting because Darryl Zanuck was denied membership in a country club. He applied for membership in a country club in the LA area, and he was denied membership because they assumed he was Jewish because of his involvement with Gentleman's Agreement. He was not Jewish, but because he was willing to make this movie, it was assumed he was Jewish, and so they denied him membership in the country club. The film was released very, very successful, more successful financially at the box office than 20th Century Fox ever believed it would be. They knew they were taking a risk. They knew they were putting themselves out there a bit as a studio. Zanuck knew that, and kind of holding their breath a little bit when the film was released, but it was released to resounding success, not only critical. I mean, the film critics gave it high marks as a film and as a story, but the people went to see the film. And the film turned a profit, which is, again, a Hollywood studio makes a movie, they certainly want to see the movie make money. Hollywood is not in the business of wanting to turn out flops that nobody goes to see, although we, of course, know that happens too. Flossie, did you have a question?
Yes. Did they know what stars they wanted to have in it from the beginning?
I don't know that they knew which stars, but Gregory Peck, who plays the lead in the film, signed on immediately he was not hesitant at all.
Wow.
The people who ended up in the cast were enthusiastic about making the film. They did not have to be coerced. They did not have to be offered extra bonus money or things of that sort. They felt it was an important story. They felt it was a story that needed to be told. And so they signed on to doing the film very, very willingly.
Thank you.
And the film would go on to win Academy Awards that year at the Oscars, which was just another, kudos to Zanuck and to 20th Century Fox for being willing. And I guess in a sense, we have to give some credit too that the American public were willing to take a risk on seeing a movie that I'm sure made some people quite uncomfortable, because it was dealing very honestly with a subject that was not easy for a lot of people to want to talk about. So this would be the first major step out of this, like, we're afraid to do things that are Jewish. Not that all of a sudden the floodgates are now going to open and we're going to see Jewish content with Jewish storylines. It's still a little ways down the road for that. But at least a step had to be taken, and someone had to take it with something that was a serious, serious subject. It wasn't frivolous in any way. It was a very serious subject. So now we're getting into the 1950s. Hollywood has been successful for over 20 years. You know, we have many major stars who come out of the studio system. And it was during the 1950s when the studio system, you know, all of these major studio heads, all of these major production studios would begin to fall apart. And the studio heads would not have quite the same amount of clout and impact that they had. And some of them were getting older to the point where they were stepping down. So some of these people who had run these studios for over 20 years were now ready to step aside, hand the reins of running a studio over to a younger generation who is coming in with new ideas and with new attitudes, and new stars who maybe weren't quite so willing to want to change their names, or quite so willing, they weren't willing to say, I want to give up my ethnic look. I'm okay with it. I don't feel like I have to change it. So there was the 1950s were sort of this changing of the guard, if you will, and a changing of the attitudes in Hollywood. But of course, the other thing, there were two other major things going on behind the scenes. Those of you who may remember a man by the name of Senator Joseph McCarthy, who became prominent in the 1950s. And he was finding communists and communist sympathizers, what we call the Red Scare, everywhere. I mean, the joke was that if you looked behind your drapes, you'd find a communist. If you looked under your dining room table, you'd find a communist. You know, communist sympathizers everywhere. And he pointed one of his fingers directly at Hollywood and accused several Hollywood performers, several Hollywood stars of being communist sympathizers. Chief among them were some of the stars who were, of course, of Jewish background. And you literally had to decide what you were going to do. If you were asked that you were a communist or had ever been a communist, were you going to say yes? Were you going to say no? Were you willing to name other performers or other people in the film industry and now the new fledgling television industry who were known one-time Communist Party members? You have to understand too that at one time, many people in Hollywood were members of the Communist Party, not because they were bad people, but it was a party that back in the 1920s and 1930s was advocating for workers and was advocating unions and was advocating better wages and better working conditions. It wasn't the Communist Party that we kind of came to know associated with the Soviet Union and Red China, etc. Back then, it was considered very much a workers' party. And so people signed on because they were in support of working people. So you can kind of understand that. Now, as things changed, many of these people forgot. Okay, yeah, I was 22. And so when I was 22, I was a member of the Communist Party, but now I'm 42 or I'm 52. And, you know, I've left that behind. Well, as we know, especially today with, you know, everything can be tracked that you do, you say, with modern technology, these memberships from their early years would come back to haunt them. There would be the Hollywood 10, who would be literally shunned in Hollywood. These were primarily producers, screenwriters, who, because of McCarthy, could not get work in Hollywood at all. And 6 of the Hollywood 10 were Jewish. So of these 10 people who would literally not be able to get a job as screenwriters, as producers, as directors in Hollywood because of Senator Joseph McCarthy and his accusations of communism everywhere, these 10 people, 6 of whom were Jewish, would go for 15, in some cases 20 years without work. Some of them skirted it by writing screenplays under fake names. Some of them would write the screenplay, then give it to somebody else and say, okay, I really wrote it, but we'll figure out a deal, but we'll put your name on it. But under their own names, they were pretty much washed up when it came to Hollywood. Nobody wanted to touch them until, of course, McCarthy was finally brought down from his pedestal of power and things would begin to change. So the 50s, the other thing, of course, that was going on in the 50s, which was going to wake Hollywood up as well as, you know, following the Holocaust was, of course, the civil rights movement. And how was Hollywood going to choose to portray or not portray These kind of issues that we're now rolling on our very own shores, in our very own states, our very own cities. And if you look back at the films pretty much of the 1950s, it was another sort of kind of hands-off thing for most of Hollywood. It was still a little bit dangerous to tread those kind of waters, even though rabbis and ministers and whatever were stepping up to the front to march in civil rights marches. Hollywood was lagging behind. It still wasn't comfortable. That wouldn't be until the 1960s when we would start to see a change where films would be willing to take some more, difficult stances on difficult subject matter. So the 50s really were a shakeout period. Where was Hollywood going to go? How is this going to play itself out? We knew that it couldn't stay the way that it was. We knew that there had to be a change. We knew that there had to be some sort of movement forward. But as new people came to the front and to the helms of these studios, that's what would bring about the change. So when we get to the early 1960s, we have an entirely new generation of people running Hollywood. Many of them are Jewish still. Still, many of the heads of different filmmaking production companies, and now there are many more of them, still happen to be Jewish, but these were American-born Jews. These were Jews who grew up completely 100% in the United States of America and considered themselves 100% American, Jewish by religion, Jewish by spirituality, but American first. They did not have the fear of portraying Jewish stories. They did not have the fear of portraying Jewish characters on the big screen or even on the small screen. So the barriers would now begin to tumble. They were willing to embrace some of the more controversial subject matter that their fathers and grandfathers simply would not want to touch. As an example of some of the things that were now going to come out of Hollywood as big production movies that would have never been thought of earlier. Of course, we have The Diary of Anne Frank in 1959. Would come out as a major Hollywood production. And like Gentleman's Agreement, it would go on to win 3 Academy Awards at that year's Academy Award ceremony. Again, a story that was a story set during the period of the Holocaust, with major Hollywood stars, major studio backing. This was not some sort of, small budget film, but a major, major Hollywood production. I'm sure some of you have seen the 1960 opus Exodus, which was based on Leon Uris's very, very successful novel, a sort of fictionalized account of the founding of the state of Israel. And it is fictionalized. I mean, he creates characters, puts them in the historic setting, tries to portray kind of the different sides, the different factions of what was happening in the Middle East in that period when Israel was founded. But again, very, very major, major Hollywood production. You have Paul Newman starring in this film. You have, who is the female lead? Eva Marie Saint. Eva Marie Saint, who went to my college. Eva Marie Saint went to the college I went to, and I met her. Very interesting lady. She came to do a talk one time. You had Judgment at Nuremberg. You want to talk controversy, something that would not have happened, which was a filmed account of what had happened at the Nuremberg trials when Nazis were put on trial for crimes against humanity. That would come out in 1961, and it also would win 2 Oscars at that year's Academy Awards. So very, very successful. One of the earliest films to do or to portray in Hollywood dealing with Holocaust survivors, long before we had films like Schindler's List, we had films like The Pianist, we had so many films that would come out later, was The Pawnbroker. The Pawnbroker in 1964, which really made a name for an actor called Rod Steiger, who was the major star of that, who was a man dealing with a lot of his nightmares and demons that came with him as being a survivor of the Holocaust. So these are films that would have never, or films like them, I mean, would have never seen the light of day in the 1930s and even into the 1940s of early Hollywood. We now have a Hollywood that's willing to step out and to deal with these difficult subjects. And again, not by small studios, but by the major studios with major actors, actresses who were willing to take roles. So the anti-Semitic fear or the anti-Semitic backlash seemed to sort of fade away. Stars who clearly had Jewish names were going to keep their names. Stars were okay to keep their very ethnic looks. No longer were they going to be told, no, you have to go to, some kind of cosmetic surgery before we're going to cast you in a major film. I mean, we can think of people that kind of came out of the 60s and into the early 70s. Look at someone like Barbra Streisand, who is a major star in film, a major star in recording, did Broadway. Is there anything she hasn't done? I mean, really. And Barbra Streisand was not willing to compromise her looks because she said, she could be a star. I have the talent, I can be a star. I don't need to go to a cosmetic surgeon and have someone change the way I look. You look at people like Elliot Gould, who she was married to for a while, who clearly has very ethnic Jewish look and whose name is very Jewish. Moving a little further on, Madeleine Khan would be another one. Unfortunately, taken from us too soon. Gilda Radner of Saturday Night Live, who was a major, major comedian and someone I particularly love. Adrian Brody, who to me starred in what I think is the best film ever on the Holocaust, and that's The Pianist. It ranks at the very top for me in films on the Holocaust. He clearly was not willing to sacrifice. Yes, question. Yes, Noel. Can't hear you. You're gonna have to unmute yourself. Still can't hear you.
Here.
There you go.
Okay, I have a sister whose name I'm not allowed to say, who was out in Hollywood and who was in movies and TV and whatever. And I can't remember what studio she signed with, but the first thing she says, I am not changing my name. That is the name of my family, and I'm keeping my name. And fortunately, they went along with that, and she kept her name, and it didn't really hurt her in her work. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Good. And that's good. I mean, this was a time period now when stars, both in front of the camera and those who were working behind the camera, said, we don't have to do this anymore. You can't force us to change names, change our looks. And they stood up for themselves and said, we are proud of our heritage. We are proud of our background. And so this is my name. This is my family name. I want to use it. You can put it in the credits, and I'll teach you how to spell it if you don't know how to spell it. But this was a major, major step forward. So you're going to have films of openly Jewish characters. You are going to have films that are dealing with openly Jewish themes. Now, I'm not going to say that everything was always perfect. For example, do you remember, how many remember the film Marjorie Morningstar? And who was the star of Marjorie Morningstar? Major actress?
Natalie Wood.
Natalie Wood was, and the character was Jewish. Is Natalie Wood Jewish?
No.
No. So there are still going to be times when, well, why won't you cast, a Jewish actor or a Jewish actress in a role that is clearly a Jewish storyline? So at times there would still be slip back, and there probably even is some today. But it's never going to go back to, we are going to be fearful of portraying things that are Jewish, that are openly Jewish with Jewish themes. I mean, think about, movies like Schindler's List. You would have never had something like Schindler's List made at that point. Think of the movies that Barbra Streisand, Funny Girl, where she's playing the story of Fanny Brice, who was Jewish and has clearly Jewish themes and whatever. This would be the new Hollywood. Hollywood taking a step forward away from the fears and all of that. So that's kind of where I'm ending up here with this sort of, we can be grateful that we have studios now that are willing to tackle difficult subject matter, not just in Jewish themes, but in themes of, civil rights, LGBTQ, et cetera. and not fear a backlash, and films that can be very, very successful with the box office, make money, the people will go, the people are interested to see the stories that Hollywood is now daring and willing to do for the most part. Any thoughts, comments on a particular, yes, Maury?
I guess going back to the earlier era, there's a certain pleasant irony that so much of our vision of America from the movies, sort of, mom and apple pie America, comes from Westerns, which were produced by studios run by men who were just out of the shtetl. But interestingly, when you look, you can find Jewish themes. And here again, I'm indebted to the documentary Hollywoodism that I mentioned. That documentary starts with the movie Shane, which is about homesteaders who are oppressed by hired guns working for an evil oil baron. And it's basically a story about pogroms, or the potential for pogroms. So, when you can look in early in films that didn't have overtly Jewish themes, where there is a Jewish theme there, if you look at it, think about it.
Well, I think you're right. I think what they did was they took the theme, but they made it into, they did it in an American setting, in an American historic kind of thing.
Yeah. Another thing in terms of Jews playing non-Jews, non-Jews playing Jews, and so forth. One of my favorite movies from the 40s is one that I think is a favorite of a lot of us, Casablanca, and many of the Nazis were played by Jews. If you can do a good accent and need the work, you can be Jewish and play a Nazi. And
that's true. I mean, and I think in a way, I've read a lot about Casablanca because it's so iconic. I think there was a lot of sort of tongue in cheek in some of that. They knew what they were doing without admitting what they were doing. But the people who were in the know got it and understood it. I think that, there were ways of sort of, thumbing their noses at the Nazis in Hollywood without saying we're thumbing our noses at the Nazis quite so overtly. I mean, Casablanca's classic. I mean, how can you not love Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman? Come on. It's just, Ingrid Bergman, good look. She made a gorgeous nun. Come on. What was the movie where she's in a nun's habit the whole time? And she's still gorgeous. The Bells of St. Mary's with Bing Crosby. She's in a nun's habit and she's still beautiful. That's pretty amazing. Yes, Larry.
Yeah, Tim, a couple of things I wanted to mention. You talk about, not getting the Jewish part. The same thing happened, obviously, with the Japanese. That all of the Japanese that in the war films were portrayed by Chinese actors because of this reaction against the Japanese, which still stigmatized them, even if they were American Japanese. You were right on with the anti-Semitism, I think, because you look at the first movie that was made of a talkie that was, a full-length talking movie was The Jazz Singer, of course. And if you examine that movie, you see that really it's a movie about assimilation. It's a movie about how a cantor who has a son who expects to be a cantor becomes a jazz singer, and yet the father reconciles it, and he marries a non-Jewish girl, and yet everything still is okay. At the end, he does go back to the synagogue for Kol Nidra and things like that. But the third thing I wanted to mention was there's been a little bit of revisionist history now about the timing of around when Gentleman's Agreement was written, because there was another film that was also nominated for an Academy Award that very same year that was called Crossfire. And it has the three Roberts in it, Robert Young, Robert Mitchum, and that is a very, very hard-hitting film. I mean, Gentleman's Agreement, of course, is a brilliant movie, but Crossfire, takes anti-Semitism and hits you right in the face with it. As far as the Jewish guy being murdered, and the studios were very obliging to do that film, without too much resentment, and it went on to be one of the 5 nominees for the Academy Award. It didn't win because of Gentleman's Agreement, but it's funny
though, because so few people know that movie. I've mentioned it to people, you know, again, late 40s movie dealing with anti-Semitism. And I would say the vast majority of people who are, you know, people who watch movies would say, oh, I don't know that movie, or I've never seen that movie. It doesn't have the same, I guess, panache as Gentleman's Agreement because it didn't win, you know, the Academy Awards and whatever. But again, a really, really, really powerful film. Yes, Chris, did you have a question, comment? Oh, gotta unmute yourself.
Tim?
Okay, I think it's Netflix, Curtiz is about the making of Casablanca. Netflix has made for, and it's quite good and shows the Middle Eastern Jewish influence in the background and the actors who were Jewish and their concern about playing Nazis. Anyway, I think it's on Netflix, Curtiz. Michael Curtiz was the director.
Right. Well, I got to definitely look at that because that is
very,
to my knowledge of the film.
Yeah, that's very good. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Jeff?
Yes, Tim. Maybe one of the greatest Hollywood producers and characters of all time, Charlie Chaplin, who wasn't Jewish, but often was accused of being it. His movie, he was one of the first to really deal with the theme of fascism in The Great Dictator.
Right.
And Hollywood was very reluctant to touch that topic at all and to make any type of thing that might be considered anti-German at the time.
Right.
And of course, you mentioned Chaplin and the McCarthy hearings. You know, Chaplin, because of his ideals, you know, he wasn't a communist. And the interesting thing was he was often accused of that too. And as you know, he was basically locked out of the United States. So when he went abroad, they wouldn't let him back in.
Right.
But
yeah, they tried to rectify it by giving him the honorary Oscar. I don't remember what year it was.
Right, but I found it ironic because he was often accused of being something he never was.
Right, right. And people forget he also wrote the song,
oh yeah,
Smile, though your heart is breaking. People forget that was written by Charlie Chaplin.
Well, he did everything. He did.
Oh yeah. He was very, very, you know, well-versed in a lot of different things. And when you tell people that, yeah, he's the one that wrote that song, they're like, really? Because I mean, everybody kind of knows that song. It's considered a standard, you know, but yeah.
Well, you kind of think of him as a no talking person.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right, right. I think a lot of people don't realize a lot of the things that he did throughout his career. You know, he's kind of like unsung in what you might call, I guess. Anybody else with any final thoughts or comments? Yeah, Chris?
I was just gonna say, didn't Charlie get in trouble though for underage, for marrying Una? I mean, that was a large part of his ostracism, was she was a tad young.
Yes, yes, well, there is that, yes. And we have Roman Polanski now.
Also, he was
Woody Allen.
married to her.
Yeah.
Pardon? Yes,
So,
he did.
Yeah. So, I mean, yes, there are the scandals, of course, that always seem to rear their ugly heads in Hollywood. It wouldn't be Hollywood without scandals. I mean, we all kind of know it goes with the territory. Anyway, that's just a little bit on, you know, so, you know, when people say that, did the Jews own Hollywood? I guess, you know, at the beginning, Hollywood was very Jewish without being Jewish. That's kind of how, yes. Calvin.
I'm wondering if there's a movie that is essentially a Jewish movie that is one that, and well, let me phrase my question another way. In the African American community, one movie that was made in the 20s, I believe, called Birth of a Nation.
Oh, yes.
That's pointed out as being some kind of a descriptor of how the black and white relate to one another, and as though it were real life. We now know that the thing is just an artificial abomination. And I'm wondering, is there some film out there that got the public to think the wrong way about the Jewish community, as the Birth of a Nation did for us.
That's a good question. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? I can't think of a specific film that I would put into that category, but maybe somebody else has one they would like to.
I do remember, again, in this documentary Hollywoodism, which is you can Google it. It's available, I think, on YouTube. There were some shorts that came out of Edison's studio that have just severely detrimental Jewish stereotypes. I've not seen Birth of a Nation, but have just seen clips from it, and it's a horrible film, and they're similar, but I guess less prominent shorts from the silent era. I'm not aware of anything newer than that, other than something else I just thought of this, that very controversial movie, The Passion of Christ, from from about 15 years ago. So
Mel Gibson,
which sounds like it was pretty horrible.
Yeah,
Yeah, of course, Tim, the two major characters in literature that have been made into films. The one from Shylock, of course, Merchant of Venice, which has been made into many film versions, and the other one, of course, is Fagin from Oliver and Oliver Twist. So you see the Jewish person there depicted in a very stereotypical way. Matter of fact, if you look at some of the versions of the Merchant of Venice, there's a most recent one, I think, with Al Pacino in it, which basically gives an entirely different kind of point of view. It makes him more sympathetic. I mean, Shakespeare tries to be somewhat even-handed in his treatment of Shylock, but yet, at the end, doesn't the Jew bleed if you prick him? Doesn't all those kind of statements? But nonetheless, he comes off really bad at the hands of the Venetians at the time. So I think there has always been that stereotypical view of Jews, particularly in England.
Well, and the other thing too is it's not film, but remember in the 1930s, radio propaganda that was anti-Semitic was prominent. You had Father Coughlin with his anti-Semitic tirades of the 30s. You had Henry Ford in Dearborn, who was clearly running anti-Semitic newspaper columns and things of that sort. So while it wasn't necessarily Hollywood, it was still in the media, people that were railing with attitudes that were very anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic sort of ideas that anybody could tune in, and radio being prominent that time prior to television, when people used to listen to their stories and their soap operas on the radio and such. So radio had much more of an influence than we think of today. Lisa, did you want to?
Yeah, I grew up on 1930s cartoons. And, there's old black and white cartoons with, cows dancing and all of that. And those were, first of all, they were unabashedly racist stereotypes. But I can clearly remember many of those cartoons of, the Jews with the payas and the beard and the long cloaks counting money. And all of those ridiculous stereotypes that that clearly this sounds like the studios were trying to get away from. But you picture people getting, people especially during the Depression going to the movies and paying, just a little bit of money for a movie. And what's the first thing you sit down and see? You see a cartoon. And I'm thinking that would certainly promote a lot of suspicion, say, toward the banks, because it perpetuated, the myth of the money lenders. And and that's really kind of a very insidious backdoor way of, continuing to put that message out.
It's true. Yes, Chris, did you have something else? Okay.
Larry? I wanted to mention TV for a second, because TV, when it first came out, was pretty much, you couldn't get stations nationwide. It was pretty much of a bi-coastal, a local phenomenon that if you were in New York, you got New York stations, and if you're in California, you got California stations. And there wasn't too much actually in the rest of the country. And the big shows in New York were the Milton Berle show and then the Sid Caesar show. And those shows were pretty popular in the New York area, obviously. And who do you think superseded it once they started to get TV stations out in the Midwest and actually took Sid Caesar off the air? The Lawrence Welk Show. America's tastes were changing, and they wanted to appeal to a wider audience. And Sid Caesar, they felt that Milton Berle no longer had the popularity in the Midwest, and it was just too much Jewish shtick.
Lawrence Welk was very middle America.
Yeah.
Very middle. I can remember, I hope I don't offend anyone here, but I remember having to sit through the Lawrence Welk Show with my grandmother who liked the music and the dancing and the whatever. And I remember feeling very bored by it as a child. But, I was a kid. I wanted to watch something with a little more action, I guess. And these people playing music, but I remember it very, very well. I could even remember some of the performers' names.
We never even watched it.
I mean, I remember Joanne Castle and who were Bobby and Sissy, who were the dancers and whatever. It's like,
Was that Lawrence Welk?
Yeah.
I remember. I have a weird mind that remembers weird stuff like that.
Lennon sisters.
The Lennon sisters. That's right. Yeah.
So the Jews loved it also.
Oh, it was popular. It was immensely popular. I mean, it wouldn't have stayed on, TV as long as it did if it were not popular. But, it was very.
He was really anti-Semitic.
It was very middle America, though. Really was.
He was?
And Arthur Godfrey.
Oh, yeah, that I heard.
Wasn't he? He was Chicago. That was kind of middle America, too. So,
Tim, Kate Smith also.
I'm sorry, what?
Besides Lawrence Welk, Kate Smith.
Yeah, Kate.
Oh, wasn't she known for singing "God Bless America"? That was like her big thing. Yeah, yes, I remember. Oh, this is bringing back so many memories. But as a kid, I always, I have to confess, I can still laugh over an episode of I Love Lucy, from the 50s.
It is amazing that you see so many movies that are still about the Holocaust in some way or another, that still reappear year after year. The stories just seem to keep coming out, and they're very compelling stories. There was one foreign film that was nominated this year as a Holocaust film for, I think, one of the best international films, called Colette, which was a beautifully done film. I mean, there's many other films, about other kind of genocide and things like that, Syria and other places as well.
Right.
But
Always
be in the documentaries and the live action films and the shorts, as well as in the international foreign films. There always seems to be something about the Holocaust or Nazism or things of that nature.
Wasn't a few years ago Son of Saul? I think it was Hungarian, maybe.
Yeah, that was a brutal film.
That movie just was so disturbing.
Concentration camp. Yeah, that was, I think,
Polish. So disturbing. Yeah.
Polish or Hungarian. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I want to say Hungarian for some reason. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
1945. If you've seen that movie, I think that movie is spectacular. It is. It takes place just after the war, where people come back. Two people come back. It is just a brilliant film. We should show that sometime at the.
It is. That's a powerful movie as well. Because I mean, we know now that we have Hollywood, and we have people who will tackle the issues that one time they were afraid to. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, how many of you remember? Pretty sure I'm not going to go again. We still got some time before the rabbi comes on. How many of you remember the mini series in the late 70s called Holocaust?
Oh yeah, Meryl Streep and
very young Meryl Streep. James Woods.
Wood.
It was quite a star-studded thing. It was over, I think it was 4 nights in a row for a couple hours every night. And it basically followed the two families, one that was German, one that was Jewish, very, very assimilated, up-to-date, modern Jews. He was a doctor. And it was criticized roundly by people like Elie Wiesel and some of the others, Holocaust scholars, as being, not really particularly well done. But what it did do like it or hate it, however you felt about it, or if you would go back and watch it now, it is credited with opening the door to frank discussions of the Holocaust. It is still, and bringing Holocaust curriculum into schools and mandating that it be taught. It was, and then they showed it in Germany a year later, and it got ratings that were through the roof. And it opened up a lot of dialogue about Germans and their past that they had kind of been really sweeping under the rug for many, many years. So whether it was considered a great film, an okay film, maybe a not so great film, and maybe not even that good at all, it did have a major impact on really bringing the Holocaust into the forefront as something that was going to be dealt with and no longer sort of, going to be a little more hush-hush about it. So.
Yeah, I remember that, Tim. I was traveling overseas, and that film, that series was picked up in Europe and all over the place. So it got wide distribution and wide discussion, and it made a lot of people aware that were not before.
Right. I mean, so, from that standpoint, again, whether it was the most, brilliant film or not, it did have a major impact on the world and our willingness to deal with a difficult subject in a much more open way. And from there, then we would see other filmmakers and, Hollywood and television dealing with the subject much more openly that it had not been so willing to deal with.
Tim, also at that time, the trial of Eichmann brought a lot out into the open of things that were kept pretty quiet at that point.
Right. I mean, I guess sometimes you have to have time pass that lets people be able to deal with things a little more.
Well, a lot of the
honestly.
survivors could not talk about it openly. It wasn't, the world wasn't ready. They weren't ready to bring it to their side.
Well, when Elie Wiesel wrote Night, which was written in French first, which he actually dictated to a Jesuit priest who was a good friend of his. He dictated the story of Night to a Jesuit priest. It was published in France first before it was translated into English and many other languages. He believed that nobody would want to read it and nobody would read it. I mean, now it's a classic of Holocaust literature and is taught in schools and we know Elie Wiesel went on to do all kinds of great things. But he was convinced that, he only wrote it because this priest said, you need to write your story. You need to get it on paper. It needs to be told. He was reluctant and really said, but nobody's going to want to read this. Nobody's going to care about this. And of course, we see what happened with the book. I believe that the book is 108 pages, but it's a very, very powerful 108 pages. So.
What other thing did he write? It's so powerful.
All right, people. Thank you for being here. As I said, Flossie, I want to mention to this, Flossie made me aware, this Thursday, as we all know, world events have caused an uptick, maybe even more than an uptick, just a rise in anti-Semitic actions here in the United States as well as around the world, given some of the reaction to what's going on in the Middle East, the issue between Israel, Palestine, etc., Hamas, the whole thing. So the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, is sponsoring a virtual day of action against anti-Semitism. It is this Thursday, which is the 27th of May. It's at 4:00, and it is going to be sort of a virtual rally. So you can rally without having to actually physically be there. I have the link for it at my work email at the office, which I will be happy to send to any of you if you contact me. I will be happy to send it out tomorrow when I get to the office. Just drop me a quick email, say, all you have to do is say, send me the link, and I will know what you're talking about, and I will be happy to send it on. So again, it's a day of action against anti-Semitism sponsored by the Anti-Defamation League. And it's this Thursday, which is the 27th of May, and it is at 4 p.m. So, as Jews, it is important for us to stand together against anti-Semitism. And it does not matter if you are Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, secular, cultural, whatever. You are Jewish.
Or Christian.
Or
Calvin.
Christian. We need our allies, exactly. We need our allies in the African-American community, the Christian community. We have allies in the Muslim community also who will stand with us, who understand that, actions of hatred against people because of their religious background, whatever it is just wrong. And so all of our allies who are willing to stand with us greatly appreciate that too. So we need to stand together. We need our allies to stand with us, and we need to just stand up and say, you just can't do this. It's just wrong, plain and simple. So again, if you would like the link to it, just drop me, like before you forget, as soon as you sign off here, just send it to my email at work, tim@mictaisrael.org, and I will be happy to send that. I don't get into the office tomorrow until afternoon, but I'll be happy to send it out to you tomorrow afternoon when I get there.
Tim, I just want to say, I thank you for your emotional, caring way of presenting it. But if people were interested, they have to get to you and they have to register.
Right.
All
That's
right?
why I'll send the link out tomorrow.
Until later Thursday. And before we get off, I want to introduce you to our friend Calvin, who loves Portugal like you do. And
well, then we should talk at some point about Portugal.
he wanted to come on there. So
you can probably give me some hints and tips for survival in Portugal, where I'll be heading in a couple of months. So, but thank you for joining us and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank all of you.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your week. Don't forget, no class next week. No class next week. We'll pick up again on June 8th, but I'll send a reminder. Good night.
Good night.